Assalamu alaikum everyone. Inshallah we're continuing today from Surah Baqarah verse 234. Tafaddal Ustadh Sadeq.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والذين يتوفون منكم ويذرون أزواجا يتربصن بأنفسهن 4 أشهر وعشرا فإذا بلغن أجلهن فلا جناح عليكم فيما فعلن في أنفسهن بالمعروف والله بما تعملون خبير ولا جناح عليكم فيما عرضتم به من ولا جناح عليكم فيما عرضتم به من خطبة النساء أو أكننتم في أنفسكم علم الله أنكم ستذكرونهن ولكن لا تواعدوهن سرا إلا أن تقولوا قولا معروفا ولا تعزموا عقدة النكاح حتى يبلغ الكتاب أجله واعلموا أن الله يعلم ما في أنفسكم فاحذروه واعلموا أن الله غفور حليم لا جناح عليكم إن طلقتم النساء ما لم تمسوهن أو تفرضوا لهن فريضة ومتعوهن على الموسع قدره وعلى المقتر قدره متاعا بالمعروف حقا على المحسنين وإن طلقتموهن من قبل أن تمسوهن وقد فرضتم لهن فريضة فنصف ما فرضتم إلا أن يعفون أو يعفو الذي بيده عقدة النكاح وأن تعفوا أقرب للتقوى ولا تنسوا الفضل بينكم إن الله بما تعملون بصير صدق الله العظيم.
Just give me a moment to pull up the translation, inshallah. It's right here. Here we are. Okay. So let me read this, inshallah. Let me make it a little larger. If any of you die and leave widows, the widows should wait for 4 months and 10 nights before remarrying. When they have completed this set time, you will not be blamed for anything they may reasonably choose to do with themselves. God is fully aware of what you do. You will not be blamed whether you give a hint that you wish to marry these women or keep it to yourselves. God knows that you are going to speak of them, but you must not make a secret arrangement with them. Rather, say appropriate, indirect words. Do not confirm the marriage tie until the prescribed period reaches its end. You should know that God knows what is in your souls, so beware his displeasure, and know too that God is most forgiving and forbearing. You will not be liable for the bride gift if you divorce women when you have neither consummated the marriage nor specified a bride gift for them, but make fair provision for them, the rich according to his means and the poor according to his. This is a duty for those who do good. If you divorce wives before consummating the marriage but after specifying a bride gift for them, then give them half of that amount, unless they waive their right or the one who holds a marriage tie waives his right. Waiving your right is nearer to godliness. And do not forget to be generous towards one another. God sees what you do.
Maybe I could start, Ustadh.
Please.
So, obviously there's a reference to the idda period there, and Ibn Kathir says that according to a consensus of the scholars that this idda period is 4 months and 10 nights. And for pregnant woman, it's when she gives birth to her baby, and there is a incident from one of the women during the Prophet where she was pregnant and she gave birth only a few nights after the death of her husband, and then when she finishes the period, she beautifies herself, I guess, for the purpose of marriage, and then someone comes to her and says, like, why does you beautified yourself? Do you wish to marry? And says that you should go back and wait for 4 months and 10 nights. And upon this, she goes to the Prophet and tells him about it. And then the Prophet says that the iddah has finished, and then he allows her to get married. So just to kind of make it clear that for the woman, once they give birth, the iddah period ends. They don't have to wait another 4 months and 10 days. There's also a hadith which mentions that hadith about the creation of a human being is put together in the womb of his mother in 40 days in the form of a seed, and next he becomes a clot of thick blood for a similar period, and the next morsel of flesh for a similar period. And then the hadith continues, Allah sends an angel to breathe life into the fetus. So this is kind of used to kind of justify the reason for 4 months, and then the extra 10 days is just to make sure some months being perhaps shorter, to close that gap if there is anything. So yeah, maybe just a few things there to start off.
Just from a munasaba perspective, the verse before this verse talked about the rida'a, about breastfeeding and having others to breastfeed, and even in that there was an allusion وَعَلَى الْوَارِثِ مِثْلُ ذَلِكَ. So the one that dies, the natural question is what happens to, not when they're in a state of separation, talaq, but what about when the dad dies? So naturally then this verse goes on to address the issue of death. And Imam Harrali says the munasaba is because the iddah of talaq was mentioned, which he says is the separation during life. Now it's the iddah of death, which is the separation during death. Yeah, so this was sort of the connection. And the sunnah sort of tells us that bi anfusihinna, she should remain in that period with herself, as it means, as the hadith that we just quoted, not beautifying herself, stay at home, and so on.
Perhaps one other thing to mention here is that during the time of Jahiliyyah, the woman, actually, the practice was that they stayed for 1 year in a bit of a secular place. No one would come near them, no one would touch them, and they would just stay in a very, kind of destitute situation. But then the Prophet, the Qur'an changes this to 4 months and 10 days. And that after that there is no sin if she beautifies herself for marriage purposes. So once again changes that practice as well.
And there's also another verse that said the iddah period for 1 year, and according to the Jumhur, and Imam Baqai says everyone except for Abu Muslim al-Isfahani, this verse is seen to be abrogating the verse that says the iddah periods for 1 year.
I think we'll come to that in a few pages. Yeah.
Yeah, so of course, this follows on from what we encountered before about the iddah of divorcee. So, a woman who receives a revocable divorce, she has the waiting period of 3 quru. And as we discussed there are two perspectives as to exactly what that refers to. Is it the menstruation period itself 3 times, or is it the time in between, the purity period in between the menstruations? So regardless, it would be roundabout 3 months. It could be longer in one opinion and shorter in the other opinion, and it also depends when divorce is effected. But there are a number of scenarios then that are addressed in these ayat, and some in Surah al-Talaq. So over there, some of the specificities are mentioned about pregnant women, as Ustadh Ahmed touched on there, and also about women who don't menstruate, either because of, being very old, or as generally the Mufassirun interpret it, being very young, or otherwise just not menstruating. So they are not able, those who don't menstruate are not able to use menstruation as the basis for the calculation, so it becomes 3 months. Here we have the issue of not a divorcee, but a widow. She has this waiting period of 4 months and 10. And then you've got this kind of discussion around, okay, so what if she is pregnant? And so there are actually different opinions amongst the jurists as to which of these ayat kind of takes precedence in the ruling. Is it at least 4 months and 10 days? And then if she's pregnant for longer than that, then it's a longer period? Or in fact, does it become sort of immediately over if, she, her husband passes away and then she gives birth, say, the next day? Many of the fuqaha are of the view then her iddah is in fact over by giving birth. So there's some complexities in the interpretation, and as we know, the linguistic reading, the hadiths, and many things factor in to our understanding of these things. The juristic principles affect these conclusions as well. And so, while looking at the surah, we are not necessarily in a position to clarify all points of ruling. And these matters of iddah and the what's known as the mourning period, the hidad, can be quite complex. There are different situations that people face in the modern world, particularly in non-Muslim countries, particularly. There can be all sorts of things that come up. Even when it comes to saying like, oh, it's menstrual periods, that can become extraordinarily complicated as well. If someone, for example, is neither, menopausal, nor do they have regular periods, so then it might be like their menstruation is so far apart. What to do in this situation, right? I've heard of cases like this, and scholars might have to tell them, well, you just have to wait for 3 quru anyway, and that's very difficult. But there's complexity in this, and obviously where we have wise scholars and judges who can provide the right situation, the right solutions really for the problems that people face, this is what we need. For widows, there's an accompanying aspect to this, which is leaving off, as you mentioned, beautification and so on, which we can see as implied in the ayah. At the same time, the ayah, these ayat came with a kind of response to and cancellation of Jahili practices. And in Jahiliyyah, the expectation of mourning and refraining was much greater. And we're going to come to an ayah a little bit later in this reading, which is often thought to have been revealed before this one. متاعا إلى الحول غير إخراج. So according to most interpreters, that one was a kind of middle stage ruling, which gave a kind of concession to what they were used to in the Jahili period of there being a whole year, but it lightened the burden, particularly upon the women, and made it perhaps a wasiyah, as we'll come to it, but it can be understood as something which then depends upon the whether the husband does this wasiyah or not, or it can be seen as an obligation that he has to provide for the women for a whole year. It doesn't say that then she cannot marry within that year or she cannot leave, but غير إخراج is mentioned, right? They're not to be
Expelled.
cast out or to be removed from their lodgings. So it implies that there is some choice in the matter, as depending on the situation, whether she remains for a year, whether she leaves before that. But then in this ayah, we have the specificity of 4 months and 10 days. So some understood that other ayah to imply also that the iddah is a year. And then this ayah would cancel that and reduce it to 4 months and 10 nights. Or we see that they can still be understood as operational side by side, where this one is the iddah and the necessary amount that you have to give her lodging for this, and the other one is to do with generosity and giving her the opportunity to stay on the basis of the estate of her husband for a year. So there are different perspectives on this issue of naskh. The tricky thing is, of course, to posit. It's not impossible, but it's just a little bit tricky to say there's an ayah here and then a few ayahs later is one that was actually earlier, and this one abrogates that one, because it kind of makes you wonder why we then still recite that other ayah if it was cancelled out by this one, and it's then in this kind of close proximity, and indeed after this ayah in sequence. So it's a very pondersome discussion. But there are some scholars, like there's a wonderful book called Al-Naskh fil Qur'an al-Karim, I think it's called that, by Mustafa Zaid, in which he argues that there's no abrogation in this case. And abrogation is something where generally most of the cases of abrogation within the Qur'an that are mentioned, you would have some scholars who agree with it and others who disagree that there is a case of naskh here. There are very few where they all agree this is a case of naskh. So here it may be that they are both operational, one wujuban, one nadban, or even you could say that both of them are a kind of obligation, but this one is the obligation upon her of the iddah, and the other is the obligation upon the man to provide from his estate for a year, or from the heirs to provide her from his estate.
Yeah. It just also occurred to me with the sentence, because I was asking myself, why does it say there's no blame on you on what they do in good after this? And I was looking at Imam Bukhari's tafsir, and it just reminded me sometimes, particularly today, I think the Sahaba, the Arabs, didn't have this. They will quickly marry and remarry. It was somewhat established, but perhaps there still was a bit of a stigma. But in some Muslim cultures, if a woman is divorced and she wants to remarry, there's a bit of a stigma around it. And so this verse is reminding us, these are the rules that Allah SWT has laid. So there's no blame upon you. And they stigmatize the remarriage of the woman as if they've done something religiously wrong. And to me, it just reminded me that people should hold back from saying anything if a woman's doing anything that's within her rights within Islam, and vice versa. However, if it's not bil ma'ruf, if she's doing obviously something that's wrong, then there is a junah, there is sin upon us for staying silent. But we should be very careful with Allah's hudud of not stigmatizing the remarriage of divorced women or divorced men. Yeah,
I think it's a really good point, because the word la junah has a couple of different significations in the Quran, and not be blamed is kind of in between the two. So one can be sin. By the way, I recently at a conference, a white professor of Arabic and Persian. He said something so casually, and it blew my mind. He said, "Junah, this is gunah in Persian / Urdu, right?" And I was like, and Turkish, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I was like, huh? There's no gunah. Wow, how did I never see that before? And I asked him after, "Are you sure?" He's like, "Yeah, it's like well known." I was like, "Is it?" So there you go. So there's no gunah on you, but gunah we then associate right with just with sin. But you used the word stigma. I think that was pretty on point there, because like there's no haraj, there's no issue. Like you should not be bothered by it. You know, and basically, what is it to you,
Yeah.
right? And before this, we saw the ayah that فلا تعضلوهن أن ينكحن أزواجهن. So don't prevent them, don't hold them back. And this is responding then to practices of the time where they would make it extraordinarily difficult for people to move on, for women in particular to move on with their lives.
Just from a fiqh angle now, being from a Hanafi background, you can deduce things from the wordings of these verses that clearly show that a woman can marry herself off. In nafsaha,
So
but
without the wali, yeah.
without the wali, yeah. But Imam Aqai, I think being Shafi, is very strong in saying no, that's not the case, because fa'alna hinna, what they do by themselves is there's no problem on you. They would say, well, the other verse about la ta'duluhunna requires that it's the wali and the sunnah and so on. But anyway, we don't want to go into that discussion. But each madhab will have its own arguments based on the wordings of
and just below there is point about biyadihi uqdatun nikah as well. But I think for the Hanafis also the perspective about not needing a wali is more strongly or specifically to do with women who are mature enough. So if they've been married before, right? That would be an example. Or if they have reached a certain age, and I'm not a fiqh person, but as I understand, it's not like a general thing of wali is just nothing to do with it. It's to do with...
Actually, we have someone recently, Ustadh Abdul Hadi, if I'm not mistaken, please don't quote me on this. He said that is no longer the mufta bihi opinion of the Hanafi madhab, that somewhat the wali is still required, because it's not always the opinion of Abu Hanifa that becomes the mu'tamad opinion of the Hanafi madhab. But again, please take that with a spoon of salt.
Yeah, I think there's different if you like madaris within contemporary Hanafism. So right. Saying something is the current thing that the fatwa is given upon might vary from place to place and groups of scholars and anyway. So in this ayah then I think we covered the main points regarding it, and that would take us on then to this issue about what's called ta'rid, which is hinting towards the wish to marry. And again here you can discern from the ayah itself that there were certain practices that were there, and then there are things which are being ruled out or discouraged, and then there's some concession made in a way. So it's interesting in a way that the ayat seem to be almost, I don't know if I want to say negotiating with people, but just like kind of meeting them in the middle so that they also kind of wake up to the right direction to go in, and they improve their ways of doing things, right? So, and this is not, by the way, specific to widows. This ayah is also relevant to divorcees, but there, but in particular, if she has been, she's now in an irrevocable divorce period. So if she's received 3 talaqs, she cannot go back to her original husband. Otherwise, it would be extremely egregious to go to someone's wife who is still in her raj'a period. That is to say, the divorce can still be revoked and the reconciliation is still possible, and to go and start hinting that she has other options or something like that. And this falls under the general things about stepping on another person's khutbah or engagement. This is shameful to do. But in this time, it was of course not appropriate to go and say, I want to marry you. And when she is in the iddah after her husband passed away, it's not appropriate to say, I want to marry you. But there's an allowance made here for some indirect words. And we can maybe posit what some of these indirect words. Of course, the scholars quote to us various things. Like, you know, I don't know if this is indirect enough, but like, you would make a fine wife for a fine gentleman. This is not indirect enough. But, you know, what are some of the phrases that you came across?
Perhaps Allah might very soon provide me with a righteous wife.
Okay, yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, there's quite a few different things that the scholars mention in Ibn Kathir as well. Yeah, like along the lines of indirect ways. Like as you said, Ustadh Sadeq, like I wish that Allah endows me with a wife, or I'm looking for a wife with these values, like, you know, things like that, but not directly making, you know, that proposal. But then Ibn Kathir also mentions that you can also ask them or their wali to not make any promises to others. So like you can make the proposal, but also you can close
Stop.
that off as well from them. So yeah,
it just caught my attention. Like sometimes, like some things make it in the Quran, some things don't, and then some things that are, we're talking about a 4-month period, but this very, perhaps it occurred more, but I'm just thinking these days it's very rare, but still. Imam Bukhari says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of his great compassion for this ummah, has allowed such subtle types of, even the word hila we can use, you know, little legal loopholes, out of his extreme compassion for the ummah. But the clear red line is you can't, you know, make a contract of marriage. So somewhat approaching that red line is allowed. But he says, because it's like grazing your sheep near the forbidden pasture, straight after it, it says, you know, what it says, but don't make the tazimu, and just know that Allah knows what's inside of you, so be wary of him. So yeah, it's a bit of a hope and fear used together, like Ustadh Sohaib put it, to not negotiate, but just sort of show where the fine line in the middle is allowed and where it's not.
I think a lot of you know, the things that I can see in Surah al-Baqarah are about, you know, building up that sense of good conscience and having a sense of what's right and wrong, rather than having to always know the specific details and have everything spelled out. So like there's nuance, and this ayah is kind of showing you that you have to be conscious of nuance.
Yeah.
And to be able to answer for yourself. You know, do what you think right in the framework of that you're being told, but then know that you're going back to Allah. And are you ready to answer for that? Are you going to be given an inch and take a mile? Or would you know that there are limits and err on the side of caution? And I think that's a very important thing to highlight, because a lot of people really think that religion is about spelling out the details. There are details, of course, but there are many things that are left to us to, you know, bil ma'ruf. What is ma'ruf for us? Ma'ruf, you know, technically, or I mean, just linguistically, goes back to what is known to be good, and munkar are the things that people kind of find objectionable and strange, like they don't recognize it as a suitable practice. That's what, you know, linguistically what it goes back to. So what that tells you is that you should have a society and a community in which good things are known to be good, and there is al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy an al-munkar, to keep the ma'ruf as ma'ruf and the munkar as munkar, right? To keep things in their place. And there are, as we hinted at before, many cultural norms, some of which are fine and some of which are very bad, honestly. In matters of marriage and divorce, there are some horrible, horrible cultural practices that we all know about in our various cultures. And, you know, there's not one Islamic way, like one idealized Islamic culture. There are different cultures possible, but it should be within the bounds of what is being described in these ayat, so that the ma'ruf is ma'ruf and the munkar is munkar. Because many things that are actually munkar become almost like wajib according to culture, right?
Yeah.
So it's like non-negotiable. We have to do this thing, even though there's no basis for it in the Sharia, and actually it goes against something in the Sharia.
Yeah.
But can people give up on it? No, because culture has such a powerful effect on these matters. You know, in matters of marriage, when it comes to organizing the weddings and so on, everybody knows the principles, but like they default back to generational norms. That this is how we do things. You know how many, you know, not to pick on the sisters here, because we can talk about the brothers' faults more so, but many sisters who are observant of hijab, you know, wedding day would come and they're not, and it might not be their choice. It's almost like imposed on them by the force of family that, you know, no, we don't, you know, this is how we dress, for example, right? So what I'm saying is culture can take over. So I think that's why perhaps that these ayat have this nature of inculcating your sense of good taste and, you know, of conscience.
Just also from like if we take from that hint that Imam Bukhari provides that it's out of Allah's compassion, perhaps maybe a grieving widow to see some signs of hope in life, it might be a good thing to allow a bit of you know, it's ma'aruf for a potential spouse to show some signs of indication. You know, societies here in the West, we're really struggling for young people, or for people just to generally to find appropriate couples, and you know, so sometimes, you know, wherever there's good, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't block the doors of it, and sometimes maybe there's a lot of khair. The language is like, it's like a rukhsa, like, oh, look, only if you have to. But you know, if we remember that the verse of fasting as well, God knows that you were not able to maintain it. We said it's khair when eating and being intimate with partners was allowed in the nights of fasting. It's more closer to the fitrah. Maybe this is also closer to the fitrah as well. Maybe we're not, yes, like you're not meant to go out, tabarruj and all that things, but these things allow for a more healthy continuation of life and dealing with the death. We're talking about because a woman after a divorce, whether it's divorce or death, Imam Harali keeps mentioning, and you have to give a gift to her because of the emotional kasr, he says, you've caused in her, the brokenness you've there's a lot of psychology being acknowledged by tafsir scholars that ultimately come from these verses. I'm just wondering if perhaps also this one is about to allow more healthy moving on, to allow these type of things. And Ghafurun Halim, the verse ends with that, so they're the two names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, Halim.
La junaha alaykum. How would you say that in Urdu? Aapke paas koi gunah nahi hai? I don't know.
But I'm not sure that we should exactly, because they are definitely cognates. But do they have the same meaning? Perhaps not anymore. Like a lot of things,
La junaha alaykum.
like gharib became poor in Urdu, right? So things like that. Once it goes into different language, it has. So it's tempting to just translate it as guna, and that is one of the meanings. But if the Mufassirun are saying here haraj as well, and I don't think guna in Urdu means haraj, like stigma, a bit like what you said before. I used that in one place in the translation. So then we have the case of marriage and then divorce before consummation. Right, that's it's called dukhul. Basically, you know, to have intercourse, or you know, at least the absolute seclusion with the bride on the night is the thing that can count as consummation anyway. But if you have married and then divorced kind of quickly, or to put it another way, because I think to relate this to current cultural practices, you sometimes get people who do the aqd, right, and then they consider this to be an engagement, right? So I have sometimes seen, you know, practicing Muslim brothers with clearly practicing Muslim sister, and they say, this is my fiance, and I'm like, brother, because fiance to my mind just means this khutbah, and khutbah is just, you know, a kind of promise of marriage. And the only effect that has is that it's now not acceptable for them to just go and get married to someone else, because you've made a promise and you have to honor that or break it off in the right way. But engagement as such does not afford any right for being alone together, let alone say holding hands or engagement.
The nikah.
Yeah, so what often happens is people do, and I'm saying they do it nikah, that's to say according to the Quranic usage of the word, and we discussed this before, but they might not use that word because, again, in some cultures they got really freaky about the word nikah, right? But it just means this contract of marriage. So if they call it aqd, or they call it katb kitab, or they call it whatever they want, right? So they do that, and in fact, legally now they are married. They have an aqd, they have the contract of marriage between them. They have ijab and qabul, and it's happened. So they might think of that as engagement or call it engagement and say fiancé. That's okay if you want to call it that. But I'm just saying legally now, if you have done the contract of marriage, you are married, right? But they might not live together for some time because one or both of them are completing their studies. They haven't yet managed to secure a place to live. And it might be also just to have a bit more time to get to know each other in a lighter way before sort of entering fully into marriage. And that is with consummation. In our culture, we call this, rukhsati, right?
Rukhsati.
So often they go hand in hand, like you have the nikah and rukhsati, like right away. Rukhsa in Arabic is like a license here, so giving you your license to go, and basically for them to live together, for her to go to the man's home or however it may be, right? So once that happens, once there's dukhul, consummation, now the marriage has taken on its full character. There is a transition at this point into a fuller state of marriage, and that is then seen in this issue of the bride gift, and also with regards to the iddah. The iddah is not described here with regards to this, but elsewhere. So if there is a nikah and then divorce before consummation, then there's no iddah for her, right? And so that means, like, if you have this sort of engagement plus, and it breaks off, then there's no implication in terms of iddah, because they had not been alone together in that way, and so there is no question about being pregnant or anything of the sort. So we should consider this much lighter than we do, and I think culturally, again, stigma gets attached and all sorts of things. Maybe we need to actively not necessarily encourage this particular method and practice, because that just depends if it makes sense in your situation and culture, but at least make it very easy that if, say, a man and woman got engaged in this way, or even had nikah and didn't consummate, and then they divorce, that there shouldn't be sort of anything attached to that of like, oh, this person is pre-married, or and of course, even someone who got divorced, that doesn't mean that there should be any stigma attached to them. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, like, even without the whole, people still attach stigma, right? So to put it in more direct terms, oftentimes the people are still virgin, and where is the issue that people kind of create from nowhere, from cultural norm? But in this ayah, of course, the other implication is mentioned, which is the mahar. The mahar, if you have already specified the mahar, which is the norm actually. If you specify the mahar and at the time of the nikah, the contract, and then you divorce for consummation, then you are supposed to give half. However, if you had not specified the mahar, then there is nothing, you're not bound to any portion of the mahar. However, you are called upon, and some understand this actually as wujub, because haqqan ala al-muhsinin, right? So it's understood as being something, you should give something, right? As a way of, as I said, Jabrul Khatir, there's necessarily some kind of, hurt that is felt or some disappointment. And so there's a kind of consolation that be generous and give, even if it is not the mahr.
Yeah.
It's a bit strange that, like, I guess that there's no mahir specified at the time of nikah. Like,
Yeah.
you don't see the practice much.
Imam Bukhari says it's to prove that the mahir is not a rukn of the nikah.
Yeah.
It just goes to show, because
Yeah.
sometimes, like, it's in a way perhaps makes the nikah a bit more simple. Like in some cultures, like particularly I'm from Afghanistan, we probably some of the worst practices when it comes to marriage. There's israf. Anyway, there's all these problems with it. But there used to be a culture where the groom side and the bride side had to engage in a full-on, like, auction-style debate about the mahr amount.
Yeah.
The bride side will lift it up and the groom side will put it down, and they'll have to debate, and no one ends up paying it anyway. And then they'll give sometimes ridiculously high numbers. But if the mahr is not there, we know fiqh-wise the mahr misl kicks in. But here in this situation, like Ustadh Sohaib said, they have to give a gift according to the rich. Sometimes I'm always interested, how come when the commands of the Qur'an are mentioned, sometimes it's our fiqh books take some as fard and takes some others as, mustahab or mandub, because both of them are commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a linguistic perspective. But definitely, yeah, like Imam Harali says, to make up for the emotional damage to the woman that has been caused. I wonder what the Shafis think of if you have not touched her. Do they take this one as the literal touching? I'm not trying to have a go at them,
I doubt that, yeah.
Because sometimes, it's cultural in that ceremony to put rings on or something. So if they take the literal touching of the other verse about ghusl and wudu, it's the same.
I mean,
word.
I haven't heard this brought up in the inter-madhab slanging sessions. Obviously, we have a discussion around the wudu, أو لامستم النساء, or أو لمستم النساء, another reading. Whereas this is mas, slightly different word. And I'm not aware that there is any difference on the, any differing on the matter that it's referring to consummation.
Yeah. Imam Harali says something beautiful about how it ends with haqqan al-muhsinin. He says something about ihsan. He says, Islamun zahirun yuqimuhu imanun batinun yukmiluhu ihsanun shuhudiyun. That the outward Islam is set upright by the inner faith, iman, which is completed by the witnessed ihsan externally. And then just maybe with the last verse of the page, verse 230, because I think Ustadh Sohaib discussed that as well. They're obviously very closely connected. This verse 237 is sort of explicitly saying, or was implicitly implied before. And the word uqdatun nikah can apply to both husbands, as well as the guardians, the wali of the woman. However, in relation to the phrase, and don't forget the bounty between you, وَلَا تَنْسَوُا الْفَضْلَ بَيْنَكُمْ, Imam Harali says it only applies to the men, whereas Imam Bukhari says it applying to both. He says because at no point are men asked to take back the things they've been given to the woman. So just some points around that.
So there's also a little discussion around who is intended by. So we have illa an ya'funa. By the way, some numbskulls have suggested that there's a grammatical error here. This is because they don't know Arabic grammar. So when they say illa an ya'funa, they're like, oh, after an, it should be an ya'fu. Of course, here the na, this is for people who know Arabic grammar, excuse me, everyone else. The na here is for the female plural.
Noon niswa.
And ya'funa, yeah, noon niswa. So that's why it's there. It has to be there. Illa an ya'funa.
They think it's fi'l mudari and the noon needs to be dropped because of nasb. Is that why?
That's what some people have thought. So they're like, well, why does it say illa an ya'funa instead of illa an ya'fu? Because it's not talking about males, it's talking about females. So unless they, the wives, the divorcees, waive their right, or أو يعفو الذي بيده عقدة النكاح. Some say it's her wali. This is probably the right thing or the more dominant opinion. Some say the husband is intended here, and then he's referred to in this kind of lengthier way to point out something about the fact that he has this daraja that was indicated, in an earlier ayah. So in general, they are both encouraged to be good to each other, to remember Allah. This is closer to taqwa. Elsewhere, being fair and just is aqrab lit-taqwa. So, being cognizant of Allah's watching over you.
But
I like to think of it also as being, don't forget also the fadl that had existed between you.
Yeah,
right.
Very important.
Though perhaps the more obvious meaning is just keep this in mind, that you can outdo each other in goodness, right?
Yeah. Just if it does apply to the man, I wonder if we can take the reading because if the man has given the dowry to her, right, and if he's given the complete dowry before they've consummated their marriage, then he breaks it off. Can it also be read as, if it applies to the man, the second bit, like he forgives in taking back the half? Or am I having too much?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the specific surah, the specific scenario that you're describing. But I suspect that is true what you're saying. But the point is also, by waiving, he can waive his right to keep half. So even so he waive his right to keep half.
It back, or he still
he can waive his right by paying the full mahar anyway.
Wow, yeah. Oh yeah, that's another way of seeing it. Okay, because it says one ta'fu aqrabu lit-taqwa, yani. So it can't be the man forgiving himself and not paying anything. It wouldn't fit with
he's also afu is related to as we saw before, يسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل العفو. Afu is increase also. So it's like afu and fadl all come within this meaning. I think there's a subtle double meaning here. So afu and fadl both mean additional and extra, and they point to generosity.
Yeah.
Okay, so shall we come to the next page? Shall I recite this one?
Naam min fadlik, ya Sheikh Usari.
I wish I could meet him. I need to go to Tanta.
One of my friends from Egypt said the first person to put the Quran together cover to cover was Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, and the first person to record the recitation from to cover was Sheikh Usari. So.
Yeah, this is true. There is actually a book written about this called, I think it's Al-Jam'u al-Sawti al-Awwal al-Qur'an al-Kareem by Sohaib Saeed. Yeah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. حافظوا على الصلوات والصلاة الوسطى وقوموا لله قانتين فإن خفتم فرجالا أو ركبانا فإذا أمنتم فاذكروا الله كما علمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون والذين يتوفون منكم ويذرون أزواجا وصية لأزواجهم متاعا إلى الحول غير إخراج فإن خرجن فلا جناح عليكم فيما فعلن في أنفسهن من معروف والله عزيز حكيم وَلِلْمُطَلَّقَاتِ مَتَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ خَرَجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ وَهُمْ أُلُوفٌ حَذَرَ الْمَوْتِ فقال لهم الله موتوا ثم أحياهم إن الله لذو فضل على الناس ولكن أكثر الناس لا يشكرون وقاتلوا في سبيل الله واعلموا أن الله سميع عليم من ذا الذي يقرض الله قرضا حسنا فيضاعفه له أضعافا كثيرة والله يقبض ويبسط وإليه ترجعون. Take care to do your prayers, especially the middle prayer, and stand before God in devotion. If you are in danger, pray when you are out on foot or riding. When you are safe again, remember God, for He has taught you what you did not know. If any of you die and leave widows, make a bequest for them, a year's maintenance and no expulsion from their homes for that time. But if they leave of their own accord, you will not be blamed for what they may reasonably choose to do with themselves. God is mighty and wise. Divorced women shall also have such maintenance as is considered fair. This is a duty for those who are mindful of God. In this way, God makes His revelations clear to you so that you may grow in understanding. Have you not considered those people who abandoned their homeland in their thousands, fearing for their lives? God said to them, die, and then brought them back to life again. God shows real favor to people, but most of them are ungrateful. Fight in God's cause and remember that He is all-hearing and all-knowing. Who will give God a goodly loan, and which He will multiply for him many times over? It is God who withholds and God who gives abundantly, and it is to Him that you will return.
Ustadh Sadeq, do you have anything on the munasabat? So we're kind of jumping to Salat, and then maybe that might be a good place to start.
Yeah, a few things we'll mention. One is that after dealing with
So this, by the way, this before you give us the solution, this is one of the cases that is considered most perplexing in the whole Qur'an as to the connection, to the extent that some Orientalists, when they were writing about, maybe quite denigrating things about the Qur'an, they're just illustrating their supposition that the Qur'an is not well organized. So they give this as one example, right, of things that they see as disjointed or jumping from topic to topic. And the Mufassirun themselves often say, well, this is difficult to explain. Doesn't mean impossible to explain. And some, by the way, some scholars use this to kind of also support their point of view, like Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam has this point of view that munasabat, or the connection between ayahs, is not necessarily always there. Like, you don't have to find a munasabah. It's okay for it to be disjointed, because after all, the Quran is not, and this is Ibn Ashur says here, he does offer some munasabat, but before that he says, it's not necessary that there be a strong connection with the immediately preceding ayahs, because the Quran is not like a textbook which is ordered in a certain way, but it is rather a discourse in which ayat are revealed according to also the context in which they are needed. So it can even be that in the midst of those ayat that were being revealed about divorce, an issue has come up to do with prayer, and so these ayat were revealed and they were inserted here. Now, I'm not saying that's the answer. I'm just saying, as in principle question, as to how we see this question about its position. Afwan, please go ahead and tell us.
I think it's good to know that, and even sometimes the explanations that are offered about munasabat, they're just like almost ijtihadi type explanations. Allahu alam, we must always, we know the reality. But I have a feeling when we look at it from the psychology of the reader's perspective, if we can, and this is a bit speculative too, but and the spiritual psychology about mixing the bishara with the nidara, about tabshir and tarhib and targhib and giving hope and causing fear. Then Imam Bukhari says things like after speaking so detailed about dealings between slaves, the dealings between God and slaves is mentioned. He also says that topics like love, divorce, and money, it can sometimes cause laxness in prayers. They're so difficult. Even when we're reading it, we're struggling. Oh, what about before this consummation? That we forget sometimes the prayers, and hence the need for this reminder. It could also be, and then the wording is like that. Imam Harali says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the dunya for the intention of the hereafter. So if someone makes intention for the hereafter, he gives the dunya as well. He can give the dunya, but he refuses to give for the intention of the dunya the hereafter. So in a more roundabout way, he says خَلَلُ حَالِ الْمَرْءِ فِي دُنْيَاهُ وَمَعَادِهِ إِنَّمَا هُوَ عَنْ خَلَلِ حَالِ دِينِهِ. That the problems in the life of a state of a man in his world and his hereafter, it's due to his problems in his religion. So the best way of fixing his religion and its essentials is his iman and his salat. So that whoever focuses on his prayers, his other worldly problematic things, even as complex as divorce, dowry, and all that, they will get fixed as well. So these are more some sort of a spiritual things. I think also it's just good to remind the reason why I think Sohaib said this is one of the most difficult verses is because it's very obvious the discussion is on talaq, divorce, iddah. Then these verses come up about salat al-khawf and this, and then it goes back to talaq and divorce. So that's why it's like, oh, it's meant to be. But yeah, it gives me a bit of a break, like it's like saying
Salat al-Wusta, it's actually like I didn't notice it in this way before, but the middle prayer, we're gonna have to delve into that, what is intended by the middle prayer. But let me just give you an alternative theory just for a moment, right? From what the Mufassirin said. This is me. I'm gonna do a tafsir live on air, right? Are you ready for this? Beware, everyone. It's not in the books. Okay, so you have prayers that come up in the midst of your negotiations and your arguing and your situations that you're facing, right? And those are the ones that can get missed because you're so busy with the affairs of the dunya, right? So this ayah comes, in between as a wusta between this part of the divorce and that part of the divorce. And just like Allah Azza wa Jalla said, وَلَا تَنْسَوْا الْفَضْلَ بَيْنَكُمْ, don't forget to be good to each other. Well, even more so, don't forget to fulfill your relationship to your Rabb. And this middle prayer may indeed be exactly as various opinions that Mufassirin said, but then it's interesting that it's not made explicit which prayer is intended. So then this point can apply to any of the prayers, right?
And in support of what you're saying, Imam Bukhari quotes this hadith too, quoting Imam Harali. كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا حزبه أمر فزع إلى الصلاة. Whenever a matter complexed him or was a bit difficult, he rushed to prayer. And these verses are be talking about the most complex situations that humans can face in their life, talaq, divorce. So it only makes sense it's like saying wasari'u ala salawati wa salatul wusta.
And when I guess we're going to which prayer it is, like out of the prayer is the Salatul Wusta. There's a hadith that's narrated during the Battle of Ahzab. They get actually prevented from praying Salatul Asr, and the Prophet ﷺ, kind of tells them that they find fire, so they're prevented from praying, and that's the relationship here as well.
It's like if the Ahzab of the Nisa come around you with the issues of divorce, and it makes you forget وَلَا تَنْسَوْا فَضْلَ, like Ustadh Sohaib said, but also don't lose the prayer,
Yeah.
So that's a lot of the scholars then take the view that it's also prayer based on this hadith, and you can find an opinion about each of the prayers. Like there is some of the scholars who said this prayer, that prayer, and they have an answer. They have an evidence for each of the prayers. Not
I think
necessarily
except
as long
for
as that
Isha.
one.
I think except for Isha, if I'm not mistaken.
Except for Isha, I think I came across it before.
Okay. Then the riwayat I looked at was little.
I think I came across it before, but not brought up by Ibn Ashur. Ibn Ashur himself takes the view that it's the Subh, Fajr prayer.
Yeah. Ibn Kathir is a bit strong on the Asr one. He narrates a few hadith about the Asr one. But yeah, when I looked at the Diyanat Tafsir, Ustadh, as you said, there's also a strong opinion on Salat al-Fajr as well, and others too. Yeah.
Ironically, Imam Shafi apparently in his old opinion it was Asr, and then in his new opinion it was Salat al-Fajr, Salat al-Subh. I think these are the only two prayers that have been so explicitly highlighted. I mean, although this one is debatable how explicit, but Salat al-Fajr and Surah Israr, kana Qur'an fi al-Fajr kana mashhuda. So it's witnessed, that recitation. The angels come and go, and so is it Asr time. Angels come and go. They swap shifts, right? That in evening. So it's actually interesting. They both chosen. If you think about it from Fajr, Zuhur, if the day begins from Fajr, then Asr becomes the middle. Although Wusta doesn't always mean middle; it means the most best.
It can be best, yeah.
Yeah. Ja'alnak ummatan wasata. But if you take the Islamic calendar, where the night, the Maghrib prayer is the first prayer, and Isha is the second prayer, then Fajr becomes the middle. Yeah. So.
There's a really nice narration by Anas ibn Malik, and I thought, this kind of captures the gist of this verse. He says that I participated in the attack of the fort of Tastar when the light of dawn started to become clear. Suddenly the fighting raged and the Muslims were unable to pray until the light of day spread. We then prayed the dawn prayer with Abu Musa and we became victorious. And this part I really liked. I would not have been pleased if I were to gain in the life of this world and whatever is in it instead of that prayer. Like having missed that prayer, he says I would not have exchanged. Like, was I to pray? Were I to pray this prayer, I would not have exchanged anything in the world to it. So, I guess the idea here is to really make sure that we take heed of the salat, right? So I just how beautiful coming from a companion.
Even the hadith you quoted before, Prophet Sayyidina Umar at that incident of Ahzab, they're not celebrating, oh thank God now we're a bit relaxed, but they're just filled with rage that
they missed it.
Mala'a quburahum wa buyutahum nara, because they made us miss our prayers. That's the biggest calamity for them. That's why the Tabi'un, they said, we met a people that if you were to see them, you think they'll be crazy. Their love for paradise was stronger than your love for your life.
So there are really bigger calamities than divorce and other, the things in life, which unfortunately I'm not too sure we see it like that. So
just with the hafizu, that word, Imam Baqai put something interesting I liked. The pattern it's not ihfadhu, it's hafidhu. And so he said it could also mean this: preserve your prayers to him so that he may preserve his prayers, his salawat, his blessings over you.
So it kind of implies a sort of mutual aspect.
Yeah, that jahada fa'ala mufa'ala.
That's nice.
And he said,
go on.
It could also include, there's nothing preventing it, including the janazah prayer. I know it's a bit far, but he goes, which sits very well with what's coming up. So from a manasabah perspective, you can also find that now.
So I was going to follow from the points you were making about the how essential prayer is. It's not giving up for anything, and as you said, Ustadh Ahmed, there are things worse than that loss and divorce, the loss of a prayer. So that's the message also in the next ayah. This points to the ruling of Salat al-Khawf, the prayer at times of war, or the immediate expectation of battle, Salat al-Khawf. Although it doesn't spell out the rulings, you find that elsewhere, but here it's as if to underline the importance of the prayer and the non-negotiable nature of it, that even in such extreme circumstances, there is a way to perform the prayer, even in congregation. You know, that you would be able to pray behind the Prophet ﷺ, and then come, you know, half of the group prays behind, and then they move and continue their prayer by themselves, and another group comes and takes their place. And you know, there's details in this. But that's just to show that, you know, there will come times of fear, there will come times of war, and that's going to be brought up again just a little bit beyond these concluding ayat on the divorce topic, coming back to the topic of fighting. And Ibn Ashur says that this is harking back to وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ. So it's almost as if all these things in between was just because various questions came up that affected the Muslim community. So he's like, if I could, I would say it's ma'tuf on that. It's actually literally conjoined, you know, to that, but it's a bit far. So he's like a little bit, you know, shy about asserting that. But he says basically, this is taking us back to the earlier discussion. So it's just that part is foreshadowed there in this verse about the Salat al-Khawf. And then these concluding ayat about the divorce, which I think we touched on the message in these, so maybe we can pass over the details at this
Just
point.
before the divorce, I just found a beautiful gem I'd like to share. It's about preserve the 5 prayers or the prayers and the Salat al-Wusta. The and Imam Biqai talks about, and he says, he makes this very unique balagha argument that it means both of them are complete and perfect. And he says in Arabic, if you say something like fulanun karimun wa jawadun or karimun wa azizun, if you use the wa, it means they have both those attributes at its perfect level. But if you say fulanun karimun jawadun, it means they need one another to reach that perfection. And he goes into this, and then he even using this, he applies it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names that sometimes they use with the waw and without the waw. And when it's used without the waw, it means compared to the isma adam, the madlul of the word is not as great. And then he goes, it's something unique he came up with. And then he goes, I looked for it elsewhere, I couldn't find it. And then he goes, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made me see a bit of it in Kashaf. وبالمستغفرين بالأسحار. And he goes, there I saw him mentioning it. So yeah, anyway, it was just a nice balagha type principle. He also went into a lot about what qunut is, the different meanings. He quoted a prophetic hadith meaning it means ta'ah, and other opinions that means silence. And he pretty much says it's anything. It all goes back to being pure and sincere in ikhlas and dua. Yeah, in your ibadah. No.
Okay, so in the ayat which talk about fighting, this is a very, you know, for me was quite a difficult ayat to kind of understand with regards to its story, with regards to its message. But I feel that Ibn Ashur clarified this very well. But maybe we can dive into some of what was said. If we've got perhaps Ibn Kathir can summarize that for us. But Ibn Ashur sees that
243?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just conscious of time, so we move past the divorce verses.
So should we give it a 5-minute pause? I know we're pushing
we
for
sure
time.
can.
Yeah, maybe a few minutes if that's okay, inshallah.
5 دقائق بسبب 5 صلوات يعني فقط.
Right,
1 minute per prayer. Okay.
No,
Right. Okay. See you in a minute.
All right.
just before Ustadh Sohaib comes. This one, it's talking about how a gift has to be given for the mutallaqat, the divorced women. This one here, it says حقا على المتقين.
That one was Muhsinin.
No.
Ustadh Sadeq wants to keep going back to mutallaqat. Ustadh.
Tell him no. Tell him no.
No.
We need to. If you want to cover 3 pages, you got to follow my lead.
I'm
No
joking.
more wow fighters. Come on, Bismillah.
No, I'm following your lead. But I did meet a sheikha, a young female scholar, mashallah. She's doing a PhD in America on this concept of the divorce gift. So, yeah, I think she's even working with the Fiqh Council of America. So
He might want to do a podcast with you on that, Ustadh Saeed, a separate one on the mutallaqat.
Do it with that doctora. With me.
Inshallah. Tafadhal, Ustadh. Let's continue. Inshallah.
Okay, so these ayat then bring us back to the topic of fighting, and there's an allusion here to a story, which is really not spelled out, just a very, very brief mention of the story. So who were these people? When did it occur? This is very much open to points of view. What exactly was the nature of this death and coming back to life? There can be points of view. But then, here, of course, we should look for a munasaba in the sense of what is the purpose of this statement, because otherwise by itself, the ibra in it, the lesson in it would not be clear. Unlike what we said about Hafidhu ala salawat, that is a standalone statement with a great message and moral and ruling. Whereas this by itself, clearly we need to know what it's doing in the context. So do you want to remind us about some of the statements of the Mufassirin in this, Ustadh Ahmed?
from a munasabat perspective?
No. From a what did the Mufassirin say about the story?
That was a very emphatic no.
It's a very emphatic no, because we talked about this before the break.
He said,
okay.
Right.
But I mean, Ibn Kathir just mentions about that it's a story reported of the people who escaped their city, fearing death due to a plague, and then they come to a valley and they find it a nice place. They settle down. They while enjoying their life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends angels and takes all their lives, and then the Prophet later on prays to Allah to bring them to life as a miracle, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does so, and then he kind of uses this as a sign for the people and as a miracle that he performs. So that's really what Ibn Kathir more or less
does he mention Ezekiel?
He does, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a common view amongst Mufassirin.
Mm-hmm.
Does al-Biqai get into Ezekiel as well? If you're
Imam Biqai mentions him, and then he even quotes, I think, a paragraph, and he says he's the 15th prophet after Musa alayhi salam.
Right. So again, of course, al-Biqai probably does discuss the munasabah with the next ayah, but that would be, I'm curious to know what he says. How does this connect to the next ayah? وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ.
Oh yeah, so he says actually for the next ayah, it's as if it's saying, so the first ayah is about how fleeing from death, hadar al-maut, is frowned upon in the first verse. So it's as if it's saying, so don't flee from jihad and fight in the way of God.
But does he see that the previous one was about a plague?
I have a lot of notes for the previous one. So he gives a lot of metaphorical things in that it could be the Arabs who had died for a long time and then they were brought out of it by Islam, or the Jews that had died in long periods of slavery. He even connects it with references also made how men divorcing their wives when they're fatally ill so that they don't inherit from them. It's like the person who tries to escape death by making his inheritance less for his wife but more for his kids or something. So he connects it to all different, he gives different shades of meanings. I was a bit confused which one he actually prefers. And then at the end he mentions, I wrote it as Hizqeel, but Hizqeel, maybe that's a more saying.
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, okay.
Yeah, in English, Ezekiel, yeah.
Okay.
So I think that for me, Ibn Ashur gives a quite convincing reading of this, which is not far from what you just mentioned, or the start of it, which is to say, this is just a prelude for this, right? And this, of course, connects to that as well, you know, as spending in the way of Allah. Also, I don't know why we've zoomed in here. Okay, we're still fine. So this is kind of the key point here, picking up on what was raised earlier in the surah. So here is a scenario, he supposes, where people had fled an invader, right? So people have come into their town to fight them, and instead of standing up and fighting, they have abandoned their homeland without a fight. Okay, so not a plague now. But then here, when Allah said to them, die, you can either take this as, you know, like referring to an illness which afflicted them, which essentially made them like they are dead, and then Allah brought them back to life, that is to say, cured them of their disease. That's not such a far metaphorical usage, because elsewhere we do have, you know, in the ayah about whoever takes, you know, a soul without right, it's as if he has killed all of mankind. Whoever وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا, whoever gives it life, and nobody, of course, brings any soul back to life. So أحياها can be saved their lives, right? And likewise, as we'll see, Nimrud says, قَالَ أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ. So he uses it in a different way. By freeing one prisoner, he has given him life, he has saved him, right? وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ, right? So there's a continuation of life. So what can be intended here, he says, is he brought them close to the point of death and then saved them, or gave them the cure. Or even something lighter than that, which is to say, he subjected them to a great threat to their lives other than illness, and then saved them from that threat. So this is to show and to underline that no matter what you do, when death is prescribed for you, it will get you. So you can leave your homeland feeding death from the invader, from the enemy, but then the illness might strike you, or something else on the outside will get you. And there are various ayat. أَيْنَمَا تَكُونُوا يُدْرِككُمُ الْمَوْتِ. So it will catch up to you. Therefore, believers, do not follow in the ways of such people, whoever they may be, because it's not important and specified even that they're from Bani Israel. Some said, actually, the following ayah, which starts to mention Bani Israel, means that this one is probably some other community. Different points of view. So don't be like them. Instead, you must be ready to do what is necessary. And then the following ayah, to which bring up the story about Saul and who's Talut, right? And the, you know, the prophet Samuel. Okay, so they have this they have this you know, message for the Muslims, that just like they are saying, why would we not fight when we have been driven out from our homes, right? So the Muhajirin have been driven out from Mecca. Likewise, you should be, you know, feeling the same thing. So Ibn Ashur says, you know, the thing before this ayah of fighting God's cause is kind of pointing to one scenario where there are people who are incredibly full of fear. And then after this is going to be a story in which there are people who are like ready to fight, but then they went back on that, and this is why they're held to account by Allah. So the Muslims are being told, don't be like these ones before, don't be like those ones after. Rather, you should be giving to God a goodly loan. You should be supporting the cause, right? Oftentimes we use this, you know, when we're doing masjid fundraiser, qardan hasana, and that's absolutely fine because the meaning extends to all avenues of good spending. But the immediate context for these things is supporting what is necessary for the defense of the Muslim safety and for the mission which is being undertaken. So give and don't fear. Give and don't fear, just like you should not fear and run away from your duty in order to preserve your life. Likewise, don't do so to preserve your wealth, right? So these are then interconnected as well.
But it's also it's a play on the word qard hasana, because, well, literally it's true, Allah will give them all back and more, but when it's used between human beings, it's a loan without interest, right? Qard hasana, that's the meaning that comes with it.
Not from the ayah, not from the Quranic usage, but people started to use that word like qarzi hasan.
Yeah, okay.
Right? As a way of talking about an interest-free loan, which, to be honest, every loan should be anyway. Like, that's a halal qard, right? A halal dain is one where there's no interest in it.
Yeah.
If it's interest in it, then it's riba, and it's not, it's not valid at all. It's also like sadaqah jariyah, for example. People started to use it in a different way. So sadaqah jariyah in the hadith is any good deed or donation that you do that has lasting effects. But people started to use it to refer to isal al-thawab of, someone's passed away, so you do something for their soul after their death. Now, of course, you can combine the two things, because you can do something in someone's name after their death, like, build a well, open a well and make it, and then it is in their name and it's a sadaqah jariyah because it continues to benefit people for a long time. But yeah, sometimes the Quranic usage is different from how people use it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, actually. All qard is technically, has to be without interest.
Well, it ought to be.
Yeah. Here, obviously, whenever jihad is mentioned, the financial side of it is also bi amwalihim wa anfusihim is highlighted here as well. Just to add to what Ibn Ashur said, connecting verse 244 to 243, he says, Imam Biqai says, the fact that it begins with waqatilu, the and there is connecting, like, don't flee as these people did. And they said, I read in the tafsir, it said that trying to escape death doesn't change qadr. The only thing that debates with qadr is dua. And he quoted a hadith that when dua meets qadr, they both fight one another till the day of judgment. There's like a hadith. Like that.
So this ayah about al-qard al-hasan, so Ibn Ashur says about what is intended by hasan. I was just checking that. So he says, you obviously you donate from what is pure of your wealth, right? So when you give something in the way of Allah, it shouldn't be like something which you earned from haram. Then it's not. Then it's just, you ought to give it to those who rightfully own it, or you get rid of it. As people sometimes have this issue about, what happens if I get interest from my bank and I didn't ask for it, but it's there. Some of the scholars at least are of the view that, well, there's no point giving it back to the bank or something. You just take it out and you dispense with it, but don't think of it as a sadaqah for which you expect a reward. Right? Some of them said, go and buy like toilet roll for the masjid. Sometimes they say like that, or just donate it so the benefit reaches people, but it was not your good deed that you did that. It's just you getting rid of something impure. But a goodly loan is to give the best of what you have, give what is dear to you, and Allah will multiply it many times over. Now, there's something very beautiful in the tafsir here, which I only encountered recently from Ibn Ashur. Allahu yaqbidu wa yabsutu. So there's two possible meanings here. One is the thing that you see in the translation. It is God who withholds and gives abundantly. So qabd can be restriction, and bast is expansion. However, then I looked this up and saw, normally when Allah Azza wa Jal talks about this concept in the Quran, He doesn't use the word qabd actually.
يقدر.
Yaqdir, yeah. So
Yeah.
everywhere else is the word وَيَقْدِرُ لَهُ.
Yeah.
Right? So here, يقبض is used, and I believe that that is to point to another meaning, which is complementary to that. So يقبض can simply mean to take and to accept something, to receive, right? So when you give, and you give in the way of Allah, and you give to those who are needy, you give to the cause that is important, it is Allah who receives it. Wallahu yaqbid. It is Allah who receives it. You have in one of the hadiths, placed it in Allah's hands for Him to multiply for you. Wallahu yaqbid. Wa yabsut then can have another meaning, which is, and He makes abundant the reward for what He has received for you, right? So it is God who receives and to multiplies that reward. And I believe that that's more, for me, ahab, that this is what's intended in this ayah, because the norm of the Quran to talk about restriction is yaqdir.
أبشر يا أستاذ صهيب إمام حرالي وافقك.
Alhamdulillah. Actually, its opinion comes from the Salaf, but I think it's not so commonly mentioned.
Imam Harali says قال Harali والقبض إكمال الأخذ أصل القبض باليد كله. So and he goes and then he says وهو جمع عن بسط فلذلك قوبل بويبسط.
Yes, nice.
Also,
nice.
in terms of here it's talking about the rewards in Allah, the sadaqah, the qard that's been given. Allah can keep letting it multiply, or somehow slow down its multiplying rate. Whereas in the other verses where it's yabsut wa yaqdir, there it's about Allah's giving rizq, and I think the reader has more the world in mind, and whereas this is more the hereafter. There it's not appropriate for the reader to think of Allah's name al-Qabid and then feel as if his rizq is being contained. So anyway, that's a different train of thought, but yeah, the different things being discussed perhaps.
Shall we hear the next page recited?
Do you mind reading the page?
You want me to read?
If you don't mind, yeah.
Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ألم تر إلى الملأ من بني إسرائيل من بعد موسى إذ قالوا لنبي لهم ابعث لنا ملكا نقاتل في سبيل الله قال هل عسيتم إن كتب عليكم القتال ألا تقاتلوا قالوا وما لنا ألا نقاتل في سبيل الله وقد أخرجنا من ديارنا وأبنائنا فلما كتب عليهم القتال تولوا إلا قليلا منهم والله عليم بالظالمين وقال لهم نبيهم إن الله قد بعث لكم طالوت ملكا قالوا أنى يكون له الملك علينا ونحن أحق بالملك منه ولم يؤت سعة من المال قال إن الله اصطفاه عليكم وزاده بسطة في العلم والجسم والله يؤتي ملكه من يشاء والله واسع عليم وقال لهم نبيهم إن آية ملكه أن يأتيكم التابوت فيه سكينة من ربكم وبقية مما ترك آل موسى وآل هارون تحمله الملائكة إن في ذلك لآية لكم إن كنتم مؤمنين.
Have you not considered the leaders of the children of Israel who came after Moses, when they said to one of their prophets, "Set up a king for us, and we shall fight in God's cause"? He said, "But could it be that you would not fight if it were ordained for you?" They said, "How could we not fight in God's cause when we have been driven out of our homes and away from our children?" Yet when they were commanded to fight, all but a few of them turned away. God has full knowledge of those who do wrong. Their prophet said to them, "God has now appointed Saul to be your king." But they said, "How can he be king over us when we have a greater right to rule? He does not even have great wealth." He said, "God has chosen him over you and has strengthened him in mind and body. God grants his authority to whomever he pleases. God is magnanimous, all-knowing." Their prophet said to them, "The sign of his authority will be that the ark of the covenant will come to you. In it there will be the gift of tranquility from your Lord, and relics of the followers of Moses and Aaron carried by the angels. There is a sign in this for you, if you are believers."
The context that I was provided, or in the notes I read, was that some of the companions were seeking permission to fight the persecuting unbelievers. But it says in the Meccan phase. And then this story was there to somewhat warn them. But Imam Harali says, he quotes something beautiful. He goes, while the previous verses highlights the taking of extreme caution to avoid death and acting in a hurry, it shows one extreme. This verse shows the other extreme, which is the seeking out of war. And he goes, these are the two extremes of the human soul that needs to be avoided. Because the Prophet, there's a hadith that he says to the believers, do not wish for death. What is it? لا تتمنون لقاء عدوكم. But when you see them, فاثبتوا. So be firm when you see them. But it's rather واسألوا الله العافية. It's best to seek afiyah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the purpose, Imam Harali says, is that this story is to inform of what happened. It's not just to inform what happened, but rather to point out what will happen in the future. And he says, إِيَّاكَ أَعْنِي وَاسْمَعِي يَا جَارَ. In Turkish, you say, what? Kızım sana diyorum gelin dinlesin. Yeah. My daughter, I'm telling you, but let the daughter-in-law listen carefully.
Yeah. And I guess I'll just say a few things around the starting with verse number 246. It does talk about after Musa alayhi salam, Ben Israel, they come into the promised lands with Yusha alayhi salam. And for about, it says 300 odd years they live there, but then they deviate and they go into sins, etc. And they become they are overcame by other people, and these people take the tabut, which is like a wooden box with certain things inside it, and so they come to to their prophet and ask for a king. They lose that kingdom as well, and the story continues with the prophet asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for someone to rally behind for these people. I think maybe those things could start us off. And then it talks about how a king should be, and like about having knowledge, about having strength and soul and body. There's difference of opinion about how the tabut actually came back to the Bani Israel. This tabut that was lost, this wooden box. There is a story about it being put into the place where these people who captured it, they put it in with their idols. and strange things happened to the idols, that it was broken and things like that. They realized this is something from God. So they put the tabut into behind 2 cows and they just let it go. And then it found its way back to Bani Israel. But then there's also a narration about the angels bringing it down, and there's things what's inside it. The the sticks, the asa that belong to Musa alayhi salam, Harun alayhi salam, and some of the scripture, the alwah, that could also be inside the tabut. Those are some of the things that Ibn Kathir covers.
So does al-Biqai quote from 1 Samuel 6? I suspect he might.
I, with all honesty, did not get to that bit.
So there is a quote in Ibn Ashur, because Ibn Ashur, among the later Mufassirin, is interested in kind of biblical connections and making making the most of those connections where possible. This is a story which, in the Quranic account, has certain things which are, you could say, vague, mubham, in the sense that it's not within the Quranic goals and purposes to get into the details of the story, but mainly to focus on the lessons from the story. But it might assume a certain knowledge about this event and this incident. And so it has a resonance with the hearers, particularly in this case from the Israelites, about things that they know that are in their scripture. And then there's a lesson in it for the believers and indeed for the others. So I was just looking at that just now in 1 Samuel about the return of the Ark of the Covenant. So sometimes looking at these...
the Diyanet does, Ustadh, Diyanet Tafsir does reference Samuel. So yeah.
Right. So looking at those things, you can sort of say, okay, there are differences here, or you find a way to see the ayat of the Quran as referring to that same thing. So when you mention like about the angels carrying down the ark and bringing this, that's the kind of zahir of the Quranic phrasing, right? Ibn Ashur says here, well, if we look at the story in 1 Samuel 6, the ark was returned by the Philistines. When I was reading it in the tafsir, it says al-Falastiniyin, so I was like, Palestinians, or not exactly Palestinians, but Philistines. So the Philistines had returned the ark after it had been in their territory for some time, and the Israelites were saved the hardship of trying to recover it for themselves, or to fight for it. So there was some kind of settlement negotiated, and they brought it back, pulled on a cart with some cows and so on. So if we were to take that story at face value, that this is how it went down, then the mention of the malaika here can be taken a different way. Ibn Ashur says, "Tahmiluhu al-malaika," can just mean that the angels facilitated the movement of the ark back to them. So there's a methodological question as to how we make, what we make of those references in the Bible, because the ayat of the Quran, we can take them at face value, we can take them upon their zahir. That is then still, obviously acceptable at getting the point that is being made, that Allah has blessed the Israelites with this. But scholarship can also query, some of the details of it with regards to what then is intended by the words once we line it up with the biblical accounts, right? And of course, we can say certain things in the Bible were lost or corrupted or misunderstood, and the Quran clarifies it and changes the account. But that is, a point of tafsir methodology that's still actually being kind of worked out in current times. What are the various ways that we can understand these things? But the story of the appointment of Saul, who's Talut, right? So for whatever reason, this is the names don't sound very the same in Arabic, Talut. And and Saul. But this is the reference, and the prophet who is mentioned is Samuel. But the thing is that in the Quranic account here, it's as if it's not very important which prophet it was, because the thing where the focus is on is more to do with the behavior of the Israelites at this time. They have missed out on, going to victory with Musa alayhi salam. They have been made to wander in the desert. There has been a succession of prophets, and their attitude towards the prophets has got even worse. So they say to a prophet of theirs, whichever prophet was with them at the time, and according to the accounts, this would be Samuel. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's only one prophet at a time. In Bani Israel, there are situations where there were contemporary prophets, multiple prophets. And that's why you have this, I don't think it's in any way an authentic hadith, but the meaning is quite nice, which is that the ulama in my community are like the Anbiya of Bani Israel. So it's almost like they had as many prophets then as we have scholars now, which is fewer than you think, genuine scholars, right? So it's as if like their role sometimes was not like, of course, to bring a Sharia or but it was to teach people. It was their numbers were also many at certain times in the Israelite history. So they say, give us this opportunity to go and fight. We need a leader, not like you're a prophet. We need a king. And they had kings in the Israelite history, most famously, of course, Dawood and Sulaiman. For the Jews, David and Solomon are just kings. They don't actually see them as prophets, whereas in our belief they were kings and prophets, right? In this case, there is a king to be appointed who presumably is not a prophet, right? This is not necessarily explicit here that he was not also to be a prophet, but he's to be a king to fight in God's cause. So they are asked, are you so sure that you're going to do it? They say, well, why wouldn't we? So all the reasons are there. And again, this pointer is there to the believers. Then you have every reason to take back what is rightfully yours from the mushrikeen who drove you out from Mecca. But most of them turned away once the command came. And then this ayah, of course, is about their dispute over whether this person is worthy to lead them. Do you want to get into that a little bit in the time we have?
Yeah, just with that, when they say, why shouldn't we fight when we're expelled? Imam Baqai alludes to they made an ishraq in their intention. They say, why should we not fight for the sake of Allah? But then they also mention we were kicked out of our homes and our children. He sort of says there was like it wasn't in a way like
their intention wasn't pure.
It wasn't pure in a way, yeah. Because also I remember reading elsewhere one of the teachers, he was pointing out that first it's Nabiyul lahum, then it's Nabiyuhum, and then the wording gets a bit closer and closer as they get more and more purified, because this group gets more and more purified until they drink. Some drink from the river, some drink just a bit, some so
I'm not sure about this to be honest, because again, that the point that you just shared is then clashing with what Ibn Ashur said, because Ibn Ashur is saying the Muhajirin are being encouraged that they should in fact have this talahub and a righteous indignation at what they've been put through. And we have other ayat, of course. وَمَا لَكُمْ لَا تُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَالْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَالنِّسَاءِ وَالْوِلْدَانِ. So these are not clashing motives. Doing things for the sake of God is not in contradiction to doing things that there is a worldly health connected to it, or the defense of right, or the defense of others who are wronged. Giving in the way of Allah is not in contradiction to helping other people. And I think that can be a confusing point sometimes. Am I giving for the sake of that needy person or for the sake of Allah? Well, the mistake is thinking that those things are in contradiction.
I mean, there are places in the Quran that says, permission's been given for those who've been wronged, or they've been expelled from their homes because they say La ilaha illallah. So the real reason is, but to say min diyarina wa abna'ina, it's somewhat a bit more, slightly more worldly. It could be argued. So he says,
but I think that they're saying they in the first place said nuqatil fi sabilillah. Then he says to them, but how do I know that you would stick to that? They said, well, we also have other reasons that would support this. Right? So I think anyway, and fihi bahth fihi nadar. So how about this objection? How can he be king over us when we have a greater right? He does not even have great wealth. It points to an attitude, a wrong judgment about things. It points to a worldly perspective, going along with the point that you raised. The expectations, shifting the goalposts, and it sort of suggests that this all in the first place was bravado. Right? There were a few who were sincere. Allah Azza wa Jalla is always showing us about insaf and being just in our description of things and our judgment on things. So there were those who were sincere, and we'll see that in the next page, inshallah, with regards to those who only drank what Talut told them. But many of them then started to find excuses. What kind of king is this? And then, the Prophet has to go to this extent of showing them a miracle to show them that this is a divinely appointed king.
Just
why does he have to go to these lengths? It's of course a very strange thing.
Like they say, he's he doesn't have the money. He's not the wealthiest of us. He's not from the family of that we're expecting. So it's
like
almost,
American presidential elections, like who's got the most money.
And I mean, these are things not far away from what we hear during the I guess time of the Prophet ﷺ as well, or in other cases too, where people feel that they have more privilege or they're more entitled than others. Sometimes there might be excuses, but then there's also that arrogance and privilege coming in as well, in terms of not giving the right due where it is. Competence, like the knowledge is mentioned, strength is mentioned here. These are really the signs of competence, which is important in leadership. But then that's not what they look at. They look at other things that they feel is more valuable in their eyes. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds them that no, this is not the case.
What does Yusuf alayhi salam say? No, sorry. The daughters of Shu'aib alayhi salam. Istajirhu innahu qawiyyun amin, I think. Yeah, the best that you've... Today I was with someone who's very well eloquent in Farsi poetry, Ustadh Faraidun. He said, every time I try to quote a poem, he goes, you're butchering it. So that's allowed in poetry, but when it comes to verse of the Quran, may Allah forgive us, we don't know what to do. It's very hard to quote a verse when you know some words, but you don't know all of it. But yeah, so that verse, the best that you can hire is the one that's qawi, strong, good at what he does, in this case, knowledgeable, and trustworthy. Yeah. So.
Indeed. So then, yeah, these things are then emphasized, that this prophet has this king has these things, and so the prophet shows them a sign, and then inshallah next time we will come to what happens when they get to a river. Inna Allaha mubtaliikum binahar. And the miracle that we have been granted is that we reached 3 pages.
We've had different trials in the past weeks. We've been talking about talaq and these difficult topics, but I think moving forward, there's some other trials waiting for us.
Yeah, the trials.
Are we going to get to the birds next week? Ayah 260.
246. I think we.
Well,
would,
by the end of
yeah.
tonight, we've actually completed
No, not
1/15
next
of
week.
the Quran.
Mm.
We've completed 1/15 of the Quran. So this is 4 months. Was it?
When did we start? Yeah, it's past 4 months. Actually.
Is it?
Yeah. This is our third term. 10, 20 weeks. 5 months.
No, we started after Ramadan.
Anyways,
I'm just saying, if we go at this speed, I wonder how much would the whole Quran take. Yeah.
No worries. Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Sohaib. Inshallah, hoping to see you next week.
جزانا وإياكم إن شاء الله. We'll see you soon.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
So next week we have